Sticking with Kenya, the situation was exacerbated by the hiking of the road maintenance levy from 18 shillings to 25 shillings per litre, despite a new tax bill which has since been scrapped. Aly-Khan Satchu, CEO of Rich Management, joins us from Kenya with more detail. Thank you so much for your time, Aly-Khan. Now, what actually has triggered the hike of this road maintenance levy?
Well, I think it was part of a broad swathe of tax increases that the government, under some cajolement from the IMF and the World Bank, were being encouraged to implement. And clearly, these tax increases have crossed the Laffer curve. People are absolutely fed up with these increases, and therefore you've had this extraordinary 21st century Gen Z smartphone reaction, about which the government seems totally unable to engage with or deal with.
Interesting here, Aly-Khan, because of course we come off a few weeks ago those protests and the scrapping of the bill. So now when we speak about this road maintenance levy, where does that fall in, to the greater scheme of things? Is it outside of this tax bill? And I'm also wondering if government had, the foresight to understand that this would have a very similar impact as the bill that was scrapped.
So it was part of this slew of tax increases. I saw it proposed some weeks ago. So I think it's just been the latest flashpoint for the protesters. With respect to foresight, I think that was a very interesting word to use. Clearly, in my opinion, we're finding a very old generation of doing politics trying to meet a new generation, and there's no common ground and very little understanding. And I think the government so far simply don't have the skill set. The idea that a government of national unity recycling older politicians is the way to deal with this problem strikes me as fundamentally flawed.
Should a move like this not be accompanied or preceded rather by public participation in any sort of manner?
So I think, the idea of public participation has been degraded in the minds of the protesters. They feel the government's able to manage that public participation process and that essentially it is contaminated. And the sense of contamination around the political class, at least that's the impression that the protesters have, I think has spread all the way. And therefore, the whole concept of public participation under a contaminated political class is not meeting their threshold.
Aly-Khan, another curious thing here, of course, is that we know that on the back of the previous protest there, the president came in and, sacked most of his cabinet. I'm wondering if that was, how that was received, because we're right back to where we were at that time. So it obviously was cosmetic in nature. But I'm wondering from a political perspective, did he think that would, just to understand how the government is trying to play out its actions here in response to the clashes with protesters?
Well, I think, the government's been caught very flat-footed. I think they've been caught totally by surprise by the persistence, by the coherence of this largely leaderless protest movement. And I think the first reaction by the president was, let me take a dramatic action and then see whether this thing calms down. Clearly, it isn't. And he's going to have to do something more dramatic. What that is a mystery. But I mean, in order to secure his position, he cannot recycle these old politicians back into his cabinet. He's got to look beyond those sorts of people if he's really going to try and stabilize the situation. We're looking at a very unstable situation now.
Aly-Khan, of course, this was triggered also by calls for a cut in deficits by, you mentioned the financial institutions, the IMF and the World Bank. Do you think that this could change the dynamics in how Kenya then engages with those institutions going forward, considering also that in the view of the protesters, those are bad actors?
So a very interesting question. Let me deal with it. I think, to be fair to the president, although he was in the last government, he was kind of semi-detached. And therefore, he has inherited a debt problem which wasn't really of his own making. It was of the making of the previous administration. It was an exponential increase in debt. The return on investment was very poor. A lot of the money went missing. So he inherited that brief and he had to deal with it. And the only way to deal with it was really to go to the IMF and the World Bank, which he did. Western powers and multilaterals was very supportive of him. But what I think we're dealing with now is a very fluid situation. And essentially, I don't think the IMF and World Bank, I think it's too simplistic to say they're bad actors. They're a lender of last resort. They come in and they look to sort of try and stabilize the finances. But what we're learning is that you can't front load all these taxes. It's just not going to work. Maybe the president thought, I'll front load it, then I'll start easing it off towards the end of my term. And in the political cycle, it will work. So I think what they've really got to do now is, of course, cut government spending, because government has been very profligate, and it hasn't gone down well with the protesters. When you see MPs on TikTok flying a helicopter, not having any money beforehand, and suddenly multimillionaires thereafter. So they've got to deal with the amount they're spending, and they've got to stretch out the tax increases over a longer period of time. I think that's the way forward for this government.
And lastly, Aly-Khan, based on that, I guess also it means that, we in Kenya, what would be ideal is to see new emerging leaders with these kinds of policy ideas at the fore, being brought forward. Are we seeing that when we think of protesters, and the anti-Ruto campaign that currently is quite rife? Are there younger emerging politicians who do have the ideas, who are thinking of things differently, putting their political case forward?
So that's a very interesting question, and one of the key challenges for the government is that, and one of the key successes of the protest movement is it's been largely leaderless. It has not had a titular leader that the president can engage with. And actually, that's given them a tremendous amount of strength. I think what he's got to do is reach beyond the political class. There's a lot of talent in the country that's available, and he's got to bring in people who are credible, particularly to the protest movement, of which there are significant numbers. And I think that's the only way he's going to be able to square this circle, go a little bit apolitical, find the talent, put the talent in the situation. And I think that way you'll probably assuage some of these protests to some degree.
Well, thank you so much for your time and really giving us your insights on that situation there in Kenya. That was Aly-Khan Satchu, CEO of Rich Management.